Immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, Russia was plunged into the bloodiest civil war the world had ever seen. By the time it ended 3 years later, 10 million people had been killed. As news of the revolution reached the West, it caused consternation among Russia's World War I allies, especially the US and Britain. World War I had reached a stalemate. The Allies were terrified that Russia might pull out, leaving them to fight Germany alone. It was essential that Russia remain committed to the West. But the Allies' worst fears came true on December 2nd, 1917. Russia's Bolsheviks signed an armistice with Germany in Poland. The Russian delegation was led by Leon Trotsky, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. He resisted Germany's demand that Russia give up Poland, Finland, the Ukraine, and the Baltic states. 2 months later, Germany flouted the armistice and invaded the Ukraine. German troops met little resistance as they prepared to push even further into Russia. In the West, however, the Germans were up against stronger opposition. When the US entered the war in April 1917, the odds had begun to mount against Germany. The Allies were desperate for German forces to remain in Russia. The last thing they wanted was for them to return to the West. With Germany stretched between two fronts, the Allies decided it was an ideal time to intervene in the Russian Civil War. They thought they could help counter-revolutionaries defeat Bolshevism and at the same time fight the invading Germans. It was a terrible blunder with devastating consequences. Ill-conceived intervention consolidated the Bolsheviks' position as the true defenders of the Russian people. It also justified the ever harsher measures they took to defend their regime. Paranoia about the Allies' designs on Russia worsened. They probably had a point. At a Paris conference in 1917, the Allies had decided how to divvy up Russia at the end of the war. Great Britain wanted the Caucasus and Kuban. France wanted the Crimea and the Ukraine. Japan and the United States both wanted Siberia and the Russian Far East. But the war against Germany had to be won first. Since 1894, Russia had been ruled by Tsar Nicholas II. Despite attempts at liberalization, Nicholas was an absolute monarch. The country had huge divisions between its rich and poor. In March 1917, after 3 years of war and economic decline, Nicholas was forced to abdicate. He was succeeded by a provisional government. At the time, most Russians were poor rural peasants. Russian industry was expanding, but lagged far behind the West. In October 1917, Russia was run by a provisional government in Petrograd, led by Alexander Kerensky. But his moderate policies were opposed by left-wing Bolsheviks. On October 24th, a large group of Bolsheviks, renamed communists the following year, marched on Petrograd. The next day, they seized control of the city and ousted Kerensky and his government. was jubilation as reminders of the Tsarist regime and the deposed royal family were pulled down and destroyed. The new government, or Revolutionary Council, immediately began plans to withdraw Russia from World War I. Britain's Prime Minister David Lloyd George and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson knew that the release of German troops from the Eastern Front would be a disaster for the Allies. Lenin, the charismatic Bolshevik leader, denounced the war as a threat to working people all over the world. He was determined to end Russia's involvement in the conflict that had already claimed 2 million Russian soldiers. He was also worried that German troops were about to overrun Russia. By this time, civil war had broken out between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, and the counter-revolutionaries, the Whites, who supported the old regime. The Allies decided they had to do something. On March 15, 1918, various senior ministers met in London. They agreed to send troops to Russia to support the Whites. The pretext for intervention was to stop Germany from pushing further into Russia. But in reality, the Allies were more concerned with ousting the Bolsheviks and keeping Russia for themselves. Great Britain had been supporting Russia's counter-revolutionaries since early 1918 by sending them munitions, tanks, and even planes. In theory, these were meant to help the Russians fight the Germans. But instead, they were used by white Russians against the Bolsheviks. Other European countries contributed as well. Armored cars were sent by Belgium. France and Italy gave their support. The first British troops left for Russia toward the end of March 1918. They came ashore in Murmansk, a small port 150 miles north of the Arctic Circle, and hundreds of miles from any Bolshevik centers. U.S. troops landed at Murmansk and Archangel, 600 miles to the south. The Japanese, who also supported the intervention, landed at Vladivostok on the far eastern coast of Russia. As they arrived, the Allies were enthusiastically welcomed by the local people, most of whom supported the counter-revolutionaries. The Allies were appalled at the suffering caused by the revolution. They became more determined to help defeat the Bolsheviks. Soon, a great tragedy would occur. Since abdicating, Tsar Nicholas II and his family had been under house arrest in Ekaterinburg in the foothills of the Ural Mountains. On the night of July 16, 1918, by order of the local communists, the royal family was taken to a cellar and killed by the Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police. Their bodies were then tossed into the back of a truck and disposed of in the countryside. None were spared. There was no pity, not even for the children. It was the end of the Romanov dynasty. Revulsion reverberated throughout the royal houses of Europe. In both Britain and Germany, the royal families were related to the Romanovs through Queen Victoria's line. It was so barbaric that even today, many Russians are still ashamed that the executions were carried out in the name of the people. As the summer of 1918 drew to a close, the war still raged on the Western Front. But the Allies were steadily gaining the upper hand. The Germans had mounted a series of major offensives, but were unable to break through Allied lines. Then the Germans, who already occupied the Ukraine, decided to take advantage of the Russian Civil War. They marched into Crimea and the Caucasus. They wanted to establish a permanent German settlement there. They joined forces with General Krasnov, leader of the White Cossacks, and routed Bolshevik forces who tried to stop the invasion. The Allies were horrified. They had wanted Germany to get out of Russia altogether, not to play a role in its civil war. In order to prevent any more German incursions, British and French troops moved into Transcaucasia and Kazakhstan. They captured the city of Baku and other important economic centers. The White Russians soon controlled the entire length of the White Sea coast. The Bolsheviks had lost control of vast regions of Mother Russia. The revolution faltered as its enemies moved in on all sides. Industry ground to a halt, and ships were trapped in their harbors. Thousands of captured Bolshevik troops were put in hastily constructed prison camps. The fiercest opponents of the Bolsheviks were the Cossacks, a frontier race from southeast Russia who were superb horsemen. The cavalry charge was their main means of attack. Even machine guns did not stop them. The Cossacks, many of whom were landowners, knew that if the Bolshevik Revolution prevailed, they could expect no mercy. The Red Army was led by Leon Trotsky, now the war commissar. He was constantly on the move, raising morale among his weary and dispirited troops. The Bolsheviks knew that to maintain the pace of the revolution, they had to reach as many people as possible. They had two objectives. The first was to win the war against the Whites. The second was to throw the Allies out and humiliate them for intervening. For all their bold words, the Bolsheviks knew that neither objective would be easy. By late summer 1918, all of Russia was in chaos. Entire regions changed hands almost daily, with little or no regard for the inhabitants. The counter-revolutionaries pressed more and more men into service, no matter what their age. The Cossacks fought bravely on. By now, the Red Terror was in full swing. The brutal Bolshevist secret police, the Cheka, dealt harshly with anyone suspected of supporting the Whites. So-called dissidents were imprisoned without trial or summarily executed. On September 4th, 1918, the British War Cabinet was outraged to hear that the British embassy in Petrograd had been attacked. Naval Attaché Captain Cromie had been killed. There seemed little point in negotiating with the Bolsheviks. Britain spent weeks agonizing over whether to commit more troops to Russia. Then, on November 11th, 1918, World War I ended. German troops finally pulled out of Russia. The British public was tired of war. Lloyd George was reluctant to commit any more forces to Russia in what he knew would be a very unpopular crusade. But Winston Churchill, Secretary of State for War, was concerned about communism spreading beyond Russia. In January 1919, the victorious Allies began a 5-month-long peace conference in Paris that culminated in the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was humiliated and no longer a threat to Russia. Marshal Foch, the French commander-in-chief of the Allied forces, sided with Churchill. He also wanted more intervention in Russia. But Lloyd George disagreed. He realized there was nothing Britain or the Allies could do about the relentless rise of the Bolshevik regime. He refused to commit any more British troops to Russia. In fact, he wanted to withdraw those who were there as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Russia continued to tear itself apart. The Civil War ground on. By now, the other Allies had also become reluctant about future involvement. They knew they had blundered by intervening in Russia's internal affairs. Churchill's views were ignored. The Allies would leave the Russians to fight it out for themselves. Allied forces in Russia soon abandoned their positions. Only the Japanese remained along the Pacific coast. The last U.S. troops, which never numbered more than a few thousand, left on April 1st. The Bolsheviks were steadily gaining the upper hand. By June 1920, the last remaining White Russian commander was General Peter Wrangel in the Crimea. A short war then broke out between Russia and Poland. A peace treaty was finally signed on October 12th in Riga, Latvia. By mid-November 1920, with the final defeat of General Wrangel, the Russian Civil War ended. Bolshevism had triumphed. Victory parades in Moscow's Red Square glorified the proletariat. It was obvious that the Allies' intervention in the Civil War had achieved nothing. The Bolshevists were able to promulgate the belief that only Lenin and his followers had the true interests of Russia at heart. The Allied intervention had only made things worse for the Russians. Lenin died on January 21st, 1924. His coffin was carried through the streets of Moscow to Red Square, where his embalmed body was laid to rest. Lenin was succeeded by Joseph Stalin, one of history's most brutal leaders. He killed, imprisoned, or exiled millions of his countrymen. The Russian people paid a terrible price for the Bolshevik Revolution. Initially, the Allies' desire to keep Russia in World War I may have seemed like a good idea, but the Allies underestimated the scale of the task and how it would help the Bolsheviks to rally the Russian people to their cause.